we have a major update. The story we have been bringing you since day one, Nolan Wells' death.
On July 11th, a Mississippi judge opened her Facebook messages and found nearly a dozen sent back to back, all from the same anonymous account. They named her office, they described a bomb on its way, and they told her, in specific, graphic detail, exactly what would happen when it arrived. The messages threatened her children, too. She's not a witness in Nolan Wells' disappearance. She's not a suspect. She's a sitting Mississippi judge who has never been accused of anything in this case, and she still became a target, simply because she's connected to one of the friends who was with Nolan the day he vanished. 3 weeks later, federal agents traced that anonymous account back to a real person, 2,000 miles away in Sacramento, California. He's now in federal custody, facing years in prison for a crime that has nothing to do with how Nolan actually died, and everything to do with what this case has become. And he wasn't the only one. So how does a 4th of July boat trip that ended with an 18-year-old found dead off a Mississippi island turn into federal bomb threat charges on opposite sides of the country? That's where we're starting today. We'll walk through both arrests, who was charged, and how investigators found them. We'll break down what a forensic pathologist says the evidence can and can't prove about how Nolan died. We'll explain why Mississippi's own completed autopsy is still sealed from his own parents. And we'll take you to a rally hundreds of miles from home, where those parents said something that's now resonating with families who'd never even heard of Horn Island before this week. If you've been following this case, you already know how fast it's moving. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because nothing about this story has gone where anyone expected. His father used to call him Mr. Cool Hands. It started on the football field, the way Nolan Wells could pull in a pass in traffic, hands soft, like the ball had nowhere else to go. Elmore Wansley gave his son that nickname, then spent years making sure it was earned. Gym sessions before school, drills run in the sand, hours spent side by side breaking down game film, until Nolan understood not just how to catch a pass, but how to read the player across from him before the ball was even snapped. By the time Nolan graduated Ocean Springs High School in 2025, a multi-sport athlete who'd settled into wide receiver as his position, he wasn't just talented. He was, by every account from the people who coached him, one of the quietly important people in the building. His high school coach would later say that Nolan's character spoke louder than his accomplishments. And on a roster that included several of his own younger siblings, that wasn't just a compliment. Nolan had brothers coming up behind him on that same team, and teammates say he took that seriously, showing them how to carry themselves in the locker room, how to work in the weight room, how to be the kind of player and the kind of person worth following. He carried two histories most people who followed this case later would never have guessed sat side by side in one family. His mother, Christine, is half Filipino, a nurse practitioner who made a point of returning to the Philippines regularly and keeping that heritage alive in her children. His father's roots run back to Moss Point, Mississippi, and Elmore raised Nolan with a deliberate education in Black history, not as an abstraction, but as the lived experience of a Black family in the state where they'd always lived. Nolan grew up fluent in both. After high school, he enrolled at Southwest Mississippi Community College in Summit, chasing the same thing a lot of talented 18-year-olds chase, a shot at taking football further than his hometown, further than junior college, as far as it would go. His principal remembered him simply as a remarkable student and a remarkable brother, the kind of description that tends to outlast the ones about talent. None of that, the nickname, the film study, the siblings watching how he carried himself, the two heritages he held at once, has anything to do with how Nolan Wells died. But it's who was actually on that boat on the 4th of July. Not a case number, not a headline. An 18-year-old with a father who taught him to read a defense, and a mother who taught him where half his family came from, heading out onto the water for a holiday with friends. He never came back with them. By late morning on July 4th, Horn Island wasn't empty. It's a barrier island 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, federally protected, with no staff, no drinking water, and no cell service once you're out there. And on that particular 4th of July, roughly 300 people had made the trip anyway, many of them former high school classmates, all there for the same reason, to spend the holiday on the water. Nolan's boat left the mainland at 9:56 that morning and reached the island by 11:14. He was with a group of friends he'd known since high school, a group his friend Trayston Shepard would later describe as tight-knit and racially mixed, people who'd grown up together. The last confirmed image of Nolan alive was taken at 2:23 that afternoon, him on a boat with two older adults somewhere off the island. Less than an hour later, around 3 p.m., his friend Warren Hudson says he saw Nolan for the last time that day. Then, the day went sideways for the people who were leaving. Just after 4 p.m., someone on the group's boat called a private towing company. The recording is short, and it's tense. "We're sinking. Can you all please come?" The bilge pump had failed. Roughly 7 people were aboard, none of them yet 21, and the boat, now taking on water off the island's west tip, needed a tow back to the mainland. GPS records later obtained by CBS News confirm exactly that much. The boat pulled away from Horn Island at 4:31 p.m., got towed, and eventually made it back to shore. Here's what those records don't confirm. They don't say who was on the island when that boat left. They don't say whether Nolan had actually made a clear decision to stay behind, or what that decision looked like in the moment. What they confirm is a timestamp, not a story. The story, as both Warren Hudson and Trayston Shepard have told it separately, is that Nolan chose to stay on Horn Island rather than get on that overcrowded, failing boat, planning to catch a ride back later with someone else. Both friends say the reason was a young woman he'd met that day. That night, around 11 p.m., a call reached his family from one of his friends. Nolan hadn't come back. His mother contacted the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, and a search began. Ground teams, boats, aircraft, the Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service, all of it converging on 10 miles of water around an island with no facilities, and by nightfall, no witnesses left behind to ask. 2 days later, on the morning of July 6th, a National Park Service ranger found him. Nolan's identity was confirmed the next day, July 7th, through dental records. That same day, at the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, the state performed its official autopsy, the one legally required in any death this uncertain, this public. It would take weeks before anyone outside a small circle of officials found out what that autopsy showed. As of today, most of the public still doesn't. That silence is exactly what pushed Nolan's parents toward a decision most grieving families never have the means or the reason to make. Within days, they retained Ben Crump, a civil rights attorney widely known for representing families in high-profile deaths involving law enforcement. Crump's team didn't trust that answers were coming fast enough, or that they'd be complete when they did. He later put it plainly. What investigators were telling the family wasn't adding up. So the family did something rare this early in any death investigation. They paid for a second, fully independent autopsy on a body the state had already examined once and largely still controlled. On July 10th, forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell performed that exam. It took him 9 more days to finish the report, and instead of releasing it quietly, Crump chose to announce it at the biggest stage available to him, the closing session of the 117th NAACP National Convention in Chicago, in front of a standing room-only crowd that had no idea they were about to become part of this story. What Crump read from that podium on July 22nd didn't answer the one question everyone actually wanted answered. It did something else. It took a case that had mostly lived in Mississippi headlines and made it a national one overnight. And it introduced a detail about the back of Nolan's head that no one outside that room had heard yet. The report Dr. Mitchell handed to Ben Crump didn't say Nolan Wells was murdered. It didn't say he simply drowned either. What it said, in the careful, hedged language pathologists use when the evidence won't let them say more, was that the cause and manner of death were undetermined, pending further investigation. For a family that had waited more than 2 weeks for any answer at all, undetermined was somehow both a disappointment and the most honest word available. Here's what the exam did find. On the back of Nolan's head, in the soft tissue over what's called the occipital region, Mitchell documented red discoloration. No fracture underneath it, no laceration on the skin above it, just discoloration, with no clear explanation for what caused it. Everywhere else on the body, the story was quieter. No lacerations, no fractures, nothing to point to obvious blunt force trauma. That absence matters as much as anything Mitchell did find. A body with no clear signs of a beating is not the body with an easy, obvious answer. Then there's what Mitchell didn't get to examine at all. When the state performed the first autopsy on July 7th, its pathologist kept a portion of Nolan's anterior neck, including his trachea, for further testing. That's not, on its own, unusual. An independent pathologist with no connection to this case, Dr. Priya Banerjee, would later note that doctors commonly retain structures like these for closer analysis, and that it's not unusual for a second examiner to be locked out of the first pathologist's findings entirely because of laws limiting what investigators can release mid-investigation. But common or not, it left a specific, consequential gap. Without that tissue, Mitchell couldn't examine the exact part of the body most relevant to any question of strangulation. His toxicology results weren't back yet either. He couldn't look inside the airway or lungs for water. He couldn't check the stomach for its contents. So Mitchell did the only honest thing available to him. He wrote it into the record. This pathologist cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor to, or cause of, Nolan's death. Crump, reading that finding aloud to the room in Chicago, didn't soften it. That is significant, he told the crowd. He went further than the report itself, publicly questioning the idea that this was a simple drowning at all. Nolan, he pointed out, was a strong athlete who knew how to swim. Mitchell's own report ends the way these reports rarely do, not with a conclusion, but with a question he couldn't answer on his own. What were the circumstances that led Nolan into the water? That question is still open tonight. But to understand exactly why that missing piece of tissue matters so much, why a discoloration with no clear cause is different from a discoloration that means something, we need someone who spends her career answering exactly that kind of question. To understand why that missing tissue matters so much, it helps to talk to someone who has spent her career reading bodies for a living. Dr. Judy Melinek is a board-certified forensic pathologist, president and CEO of a forensic pathology consulting firm, with no connection to this case, no client on either side, and no reason to lean one way or the other. When Mississippi's WXXV News asked her to walk through Mitchell's preliminary findings, she didn't offer a verdict. She offered a framework for how to actually read one. Start with the discoloration on the back of Nolan's head, the single detail from Mitchell's report that's generated the most speculation online. Melanek's read on it is more measured than most of that speculation. Discoloration can come from all kinds of sources, she told ABC News, and in a body that had already begun decomposing by the time of the second exam, it could just be a consequence of decomposition rather than any kind of injury. The fact that Mitchell himself couldn't say what caused it, she added, is itself telling, a signal that even the pathologist who found it isn't certain it's trauma at all. Then there's the neck. What actually stayed behind at the state's office, according to Crump's own reading of the report, wasn't some vague, unspecified tissue. It was Nolan's tracheal and laryngeal cartilages, his thyroid horn, and his hyoid bone. That last one matters more than its size suggests. The hyoid is a small, U-shaped bone that sits at the front of the throat, unattached to any other bone in the body, and it's one of the first things a forensic pathologist checks when strangulation is even a possibility, because it's exactly the kind of structure that can fracture under sustained pressure to the neck, and exactly the kind of finding that's hard to explain away if it's there. Mitchell never got the chance to look at it. Neither did anyone else outside the state's own office. That gap is exactly why this case can produce two statements that sound like they contradict each other, but don't. Dr. Michelle Dupre, a former medical examiner who's also reviewed the case publicly, made a related point more bluntly. Retaining those structures hampers what a second autopsy can actually prove, not because Mitchell did anything wrong, but because you cannot rule something out using evidence you were never given. She also pushed back on how quickly some officials moved to downplay foul play in the earliest hours of this case, warning publicly against what she called tunnel vision. Melinek raised one more wrinkle that's easy to miss: toxicology. If a future report shows alcohol in Nolan's system, she cautioned, that number can't be read at face value. When a body starts to decompose, bacteria can produce alcohol in the bloodstream, she explained, meaning a positive result wouldn't necessarily mean Nolan had been drinking. It could mean nothing about his behavior that day at all, and everything about how long his body sat in the water before anyone found him. None of this proves Nolan Wells was strangled. No pathologist involved in this case, not Mitchell, not Melanick, not Dupree, has said that. What it proves is narrower, and in some ways more unsettling, that the one piece of evidence most capable of answering the question definitively is sitting in a jar at the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's office, and nobody outside that building has been allowed to look at it yet. The judge from earlier in this story has a name, Ashley Cole. She sits on the Jackson County Chancery Court, and she's connected to this case through family. She's the stepmother of Warren Hudson, one of the friends who was with Nolan on Horn Island the day he disappeared, and the same friend who earlier described the bilge pump emergency that sent his boat back to shore without Nolan. Cole didn't stay quiet in the weeks after Nolan went missing. She posted publicly, laying out her stepson's version of that afternoon. The last sighting at 3 p.m., the boat taking on water, Nolan's decision to stay behind. It was a defense of her family, made in public, on the record, and within weeks, it made her a target. On July 11th, an anonymous Facebook account sent Cole nearly a dozen messages, back to back. They named her office specifically. They described a package on its way. One, the account wrote, that would be impossible to miss when it arrived. The messages got more specific from there. Details meant to frighten, details about what would happen once that package was opened, and a deadline measured in seconds. Later messages went further still, referencing Cole's own children. That same account had called the Jackson County Chancery Court's office number directly, in the middle of the night that same day. For federal investigators, an anonymous Facebook account isn't actually anonymous, not if you know where to look. Agents traced the account, which had been posting under the handle YYE962, back through its associated email address. That email led to an IP address. The IP address led to a phone number. The phone number led to a street address in Sacramento, California, roughly 2,000 miles from Cole's courtroom in Mississippi. That trail ended at a 27-year-old named Joseph Alfredo Vasquez Dumars. On July 30th, federal agents arrested him in Sacramento. He's now charged with interstate transmission of a threatening communication, a federal crime that carries up to 5 years in prison, a $250,000 fine, and 3 years of supervised release if he's convicted. Cole wasn't the only one. Around the same time, Nolan's own mother, Christine, reported that her family had become a target of online harassment too. An FBI spokesperson in Jackson later confirmed what that pattern suggests. Federal agents were working multiple threats connected to this case at once, running in parallel with Mississippi's own investigation into how Nolan actually died. Dumars's arrest proved something real, that federal law enforcement takes these threats seriously enough to trace them across the country and prosecute them as felonies. What it didn't do, what it couldn't do, is answer a single question about what happened to Nolan Wells. Those are two entirely different investigations, and the very next day, a second arrest would prove Dumars wasn't alone, not in spirit, and, as it turned out, not even in timing. The second arrest came just days after the first, and in the same city where Nolan's parents would soon be standing on a stage, though the two things have no connection beyond a coincidence of geography and timing. On July 23rd, a series of calls hit two different Mississippi offices within about an hour of each other. The first set, 21 calls in 8 minutes, went to the George County Chancery Clerk's office from a blocked number. The caller told them not to go outside, told them the clock was ticking. The second set went to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the same agency leading the investigation into Nolan's death. 8 calls in 18 minutes, this time using *67 to mask the number. The caller claimed there was a bomb outside and warned them to stay in. The sheriff's office locked the building down and ran a full bomb sweep. Nothing was found. Investigators moved the same way they had with Dumars. They went after the number, not the voice. An emergency request to the phone carriers turned up a number. That number led to a Cash App account. The Cash App account had a name attached, and Cincinnati Police Department's own records, pulled through a federal database, confirmed the same person as the registered owner, Michelle Francine Edwards, 41. Cell tower data placed her phone near her known Cincinnati addresses that same night. On July 30th, prosecutors in the Southern District of Mississippi charged Edwards with the exact same offense as Dumars, transmitting a threatening communication in interstate commerce, carrying the exact same maximum, 5 years in prison, a $250,000 fine, 3 years of supervised release. She was arrested the next day and is currently being held in Ohio, awaiting extradition to Mississippi to face the charge. 2 people, 2 states, 2 federal cases, both opened in the span of about a week, both aimed at offices and officials with no power over how Nolan actually died, and both, in their own way, proof of exactly how far this case has traveled beyond one island off the Mississippi coast. The state's own autopsy happened fast. On July 7th, the same day Nolan's body was formally identified, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office performed its legally required exam. The state, in other words, had first access to the body before the family's own pathologist ever got the chance. What they found with that head start is still, as of tonight, a secret. On July 23rd, Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath addressed that directly in a video statement aimed squarely at a public that had started to ask why. Her answer? This isn't special treatment, and it isn't concealment. Every death investigation in the county, aside from natural deaths and non-criminal car accidents, gets presented to a grand jury as a matter of routine, something she said she's followed for her entire career. Evidence connected to those cases stays out of public view specifically until the grand jury reviews it fresh, unshaped by news coverage or public opinion. The pressure for answers, she said, does not change what the work requires. Not everyone accepts that this case has been handled evenly from the start. Terrence Keel, one of the outside experts CNN consulted on the investigation, has argued publicly that local authorities started this case on the wrong foot by telling the public early on that foul play wasn't suspected before any real investigation had happened. He's connected that early misstep to something larger, a long-standing distrust in black communities of how official death investigations get handled. McElrath's office hasn't directly answered that criticism. Her position has stayed the same. This is procedure, not preference. As of this week, that procedure has moved one step further. Officials confirm the state's autopsy is now fully complete. Not the findings, just the fact that it's finished. Nolan's own parents and the legal team representing them still haven't been shown what it says. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Dr. Mitchell isn't finished either. He's actively working to obtain the one piece of Nolan's body he was never given in the first place: his throat, still sitting in Mississippi, waiting on a legal process with no announced end date. So, here's where this stands. 2 completed autopsies, 2 different pathologists, and still not one publicly confirmed answer to the only question that actually matters to the people who loved him. Nolan's parents haven't stopped asking it, and days ago, they took that question somewhere nobody expected, a stage hundreds of miles from home, in front of strangers who'd never heard of Horn Island. Cincinnati sits hundreds of miles from Horn Island, geographically, about as far removed from this story as you can get and still be talking about the same case. But on July 31st, that's exactly where Nolan's parents stood, on a stage at Fountain Square, in the middle of downtown Cincinnati, in front of a crowd that had gathered for something that, on paper, had nothing to do with their son. The occasion was Omega Psi Phi fraternity's 85th Grand Conclave, a national gathering of one of the country's oldest black fraternities. Ben Crump is a member. That membership is the thread connecting a Mississippi missing persons case to a stage in Ohio. Crump brought Nolan's story to his own fraternity brothers, and roughly 100 people showed up to hear it, including Cincinnati City Manager Cheryl Long and Vice Mayor Jan Michelle Kearney. Christine Wansley didn't talk about autopsy reports or grand juries that day. She talked about something she said she'd already taught her children, long before any of this happened: a lesson she called painful but necessary. Being more careful, more observant, more discerning, she said, in spaces with people who don't look like you. She used the word unfortunately before all of it, and it wasn't an accident. It was a mother naming something she wishes weren't true in front of a crowd of strangers because her own family's experience had forced her to say it out loud. It's worth remembering, hearing that Nolan's own family doesn't fit into one simple box. His mother is half Filipino. His father's family has been black in Mississippi for generations. He grew up fluent in both. And still, his death has become something bigger than either. A flashpoint in a much older, much broader conversation about which spaces feel safe and for whom. Crump followed her at the podium and kept his own message just as direct, that Nolan's life carries exactly the same weight as the cause the room had gathered around, and that his team isn't stopping until they get real answers about what happened to him. The Wansleys put their own goal even more simply than that. They wanted, they said, to keep local authorities accountable and to make sure the investigation into their son's death is actually unbiased and actually complete. Nearly a month after Nolan disappeared, his parents are no longer just fighting for information from one county in Mississippi. They're standing in front of strangers in other states now, turning a private search for answers into something a lot of families, in a lot of places, have started paying attention to. So here's where this actually stands, stripped of speculation. Confirmed, Nolan Wells died sometime after 3 p.m. on July 4th, in the water off Horn Island. 2 separate autopsies have been performed, one by the state, one independent, and neither has produced a determined cause or manner of death. The independent exam found unexplained discoloration on the back of his head and could not rule out an injury to his neck because the structures needed to check for that injury were never released to the pathologist who examined him. The state's autopsy is complete, but sealed, pending review by a grand jury with no announced timeline. And 2 people, in 2 different states, are now facing federal charges for threatening people connected to this case, neither of them anywhere near Horn Island on July 4th, and neither of them able to answer the one question everyone actually wants answered. Still unanswered. What actually happened between 3 p.m., when Warren Hudson last saw him, and the moment days later when a park ranger found his body? Whether the neck structures the state is still holding contain anything at all. What the completed state autopsy says, information Nolan's own parents don't have yet. And whether a grand jury, whenever it finally convenes, will find enough to act on, or close this as a tragedy with no one left to answer for it. What investigators are waiting on is, in some ways, simpler than the mystery itself. Full toxicology, a grand jury date, and access, for Mitchell, and eventually for the public, to the one piece of physical evidence still locked away in Mississippi. It's worth ending, though, on something other than what's missing. Before any of this, Nolan Wells was a kid his father nicknamed for his hands, not his hardship. He was the older brother who taught his own siblings how to carry themselves on the same field he played on. He was fluent in 2 histories most people never think to hold at once, and by every account from the people who actually knew him, he carried all of it with more humility than the situation required of an 18-year-old with real football talent and a real future in front of him. That's who disappeared on a boat trip that was supposed to be nothing more than a holiday. His parents haven't gotten the answer they're owed yet. Neither has anyone else. But they haven't stopped asking. And as long as they haven't, neither will we. When the grand jury moves, when that report is finally unsealed, when Mitchell gets what he's been asking for, we'll be back with what it actually says. Not before we know it's real, just when we do.